Hi. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the three of these concepts: visualization, sustainability, and growth. This talk is going to be a little big picture, so be prepared for some big, crazy ideas and a lot of hand waving. I'm going to start by telling you a little story. Back in 2007, I was working for an agency that had as our client a big bank, whose name I cannot name right now, for confidentiality reasons. They wanted, back in 2007, to discover ways to really innovate the way that banking was done. And so they hired an agency to conduct some contextual inquiry, and then they brought us in to do some strategic UX design. And what came out of this research that we did with them was that their customers really wanted the bank to invest in them. And I don't mean just investing in a user interface or a website or an app. Customers actually wanted this bank to help them get out of debt and build wealth so that they could become investors. This was a totally mind-blowing idea at the time. Unfortunately, by the time we wrapped up this work, it was 2008. And if you remember anything about 2008, there were a few other distractions happening. So I have no idea if this work actually was implemented. But what this highlighted for me was that there was a real problem with the model in how banks make money and how our economy makes money in general. And 2008, if it taught us anything, was that our entire concept of economic growth is broken. And that the reason for this is that there's too much of a burden placed on debtors, the people who are trying to pay off their credit cards, just trying to make ends meet. And this is what we heard from customers in this work with this bank, that the bank was nickel and diming them to death, that they were getting money now, cash now through their credit cards or home loans or auto loans, and then the bank was bleeding them dry in the subsequent years because they were chained to this mountain of debt. And this problem is actually made worse by this almost zero-sum game in our economy where investors are giving the bank money now with this expectation of constant growth, constant financial returns in the future. And where that money comes from, where that growth comes from, is from interest on debt, ultimately. So that's one way in which the system is currently not sustainable. And unfortunately, especially at about the time of 2008 and the bubble that led up to it, how growth was being visualized was also broken. The indicators for the health of the overall system and the sustainability of the overall system were just not visible in the simple line graphs and charts that investors had available to them and that consumers had available to them to gauge their own financial health. All they could see was that an index for a stock was going up. And then you had investors that were placing bets on whether or not a stock would go up. And then you had still other investors who were placing bets on derivatives that were looking at whether or not a stock would go up over time in accelerating growth cycles. And then you had still other investors, for instance, in hedge fund markets and in futures markets, who were looking at the analysts' expectations for what would happen to a stock. And they didn't even care whether or not it went up. They just cared whether or not their prediction about it, their gamble was going to pay off. This was just not sustainable. So how do we get to a system where the graphs and charts that we are using to make financial decisions really map back to the true sustainability of the system? And in order to do that, we have to understand what sustainability is and where it really comes from. Our current a sustainable system is one in which the limited resources that we have available to us are being used at a rate that is in balance with how quickly those same resources are being renewed. And as long as those things are in balance, the system can go on indefinitely. But we have an economic system that depends on constant growth. And in order for that to happen, you have to have something new being added to the system all the time. So, what are some sources of virtually infinite growth? Well, I can think of 3 things. I'm sure there are more, but these are the ones that I've come up with in my reading and in the work that I've done with clients. New ideas are a virtually infinite well of new information that can be added to the system. And this comes from research. This comes from exploration and invention and experimentation. Another nearly infinite resource is people. New markets, new places. You can take products to a new place where it's never been introduced before. You can take a product and redefine it as belonging to a completely new category and selling it to a new industry. And as long as people are out there making babies, there will always be more people to sell more things to, right? But when we have some resources, some actual material goods and energy that are constantly being added to the system and are virtually infinite, gravity is never going to go away. The sun, for all intents and purposes, is never going to go away. And if we can find a way to conserve our finite resources, such as potable water and fossil fuels, and rely more on infinite resources like the sun and gravity and ideas and the energy that human beings have to work, we can come up with a system that adds to that core cycle of debt and investment, constantly adds new stuff to the system. And that new stuff is connected in this interconnected web where ideas are driving the invention of new products. And those new products are then sold to these new markets, new people, and that's how wealth gets into the system. And for this entire thing to go, people have to eat. These are human beings that are involved in this entire thing, and they have to get the energy to think and to work, and that comes from our food and our environment. We are a long way from really visualizing how that bigger picture is connected to our bank balance or the performance of our mutual funds. But we, as user experience designers and usability professionals, have this responsibility and this opportunity, and we have tools in our palette to really make this visible to our users. A few things that we can use: we can make things bigger to show that they're growing. We can move items along spectrum to show that something has changed from being small to being large. We can use heat maps and color. We can use flowcharts to show the interconnection between different actors within the system, and we can create concept maps that show how concepts are related to each other, how categories are related to each other. And then we can combine these things together to show the balance of them, to make sure that things, we are not using up our finite resources at a rate that is unsustainable. There are a few places out there where this is starting to be done. I wouldn't say that it's perfect yet, but one example is Morningstar. They rate different funds and investments based on their risk to reward ratio and the size of the business. Mint, for consumers, is showing people where their money is going and giving them tools to manage their money. But it's still pretty far cry away from this. So what I'd like to leave you with is really this call to action for those user interface designers out there. You have the power to govern what decisions people make based on the financial information at their fingertips. The entire economic system can't really be re-engineered from the top down because it's made up of people autonomous human beings who are making decisions independently based on the information they have available to them. But we who are designing the information that those people use, we can choose what goes into the columns and rows of a spreadsheet. And we can choose the labels that belong in each of those. We can design the information, the charts and graphs that people use to gauge their financial health and the health of the entire system. And because what we choose to visualize will determine how it's evaluated, and the way that we structure it will determine the meaning that people take away from it. So I know it's kind of, sometimes financial work is a little bit boring, but there's a lot of power there, and I think we have a long road ahead of us, and it's exciting. So, thank you.
All right. Thank you, Aaron, very much.